The dust settled on the wooden platform as the train screeched to a halt at Broken Creek Station. Thomas Crow stood apart from the crowd, his weathered face betraying no emotion. 10 years of solitude had taught him patience, but today was different. The townspeople watched with suspicion as the tall Apache adjusted his worn hat, eyes fixed on the passenger car. Inside, Catherine Palmer clutched the marriage certificate in trembling hands. A schoolteacher from Boston had no business marrying a man she'd never met, let alone an Indian scout with a reputation that traveled faster than telegraph wire. Would this stranger honor their arrangement, or had she made the gravest mistake of her life? As hostile whispers circled the platform, Thomas stepped forward, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Catherine drew a deep breath and stepped down from the train, her gloved hand hesitating before accepting the weathered one Thomas offered. The leather of his palm felt rough against her skin, yet his grip was careful, almost delicate. She hadn't expected that. "Mrs. Crow," he said, the name sounding foreign to them both. His voice was deeper than she'd imagined from his letters, with a cadence that revealed his heritage despite the formal English. "Mr. Crow," she replied, willing her voice not to tremble. Up close, he was taller than she'd anticipated, his shoulders broad beneath a worn but clean shirt. Dark eyes studied her from beneath the brim of his hat, revealing nothing. The station master pointedly turned his back as Thomas collected her carpetbag. The small leather case contained everything she deemed essential enough to bring west. 2 dresses, undergarments, her mother's Bible, teaching certificates, and a handful of books she couldn't bear to leave behind. 10 years of her life reduced to what could fit in a single bag. "That all you got?" Thomas asked, the slightest furrow appearing between his brows. "Yes, I travel light." She straightened her spine, chin lifting slightly. "I found possessions to be less important than knowledge." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps even approval, before his face returned to its careful neutrality. "Wagons this way," he said, nodding toward the edge of town. They walked in silence, Catherine acutely aware of the stares following them. Women pulled children closer as they passed. Men's hands drifted toward belt loops where weapons might be concealed. A group of young boys followed at a distance, whispering and snickering until Thomas turned his head slightly in their direction. They scattered like startled birds. "They don't much like Indians here," Thomas said quietly. "So I see." Catherine felt a flush of anger. "Their manners leave much to be desired." The ghost of a smile touched his lips, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. The wagon was modest but sturdy, the horse well-groomed despite its advancing years. Thomas placed her carpetbag carefully in the back, then helped her onto the wooden seat. The board felt hard beneath her, a stark reminder of the comforts she'd left behind. As they pulled away from Broken Creek, Catherine caught sight of a man watching from the doorway of what appeared to be a government office. Unlike the others, his gaze held calculation rather than mere disgust. Thomas noticed her attention. "Mayor Hollister," he explained, "owns half the businesses in town. Thinks he owns everything else, too." "Including you?" she asked. Thomas's hands tightened on the reins. "He'd like to. Man can't stand the idea of an Apache owning land that white folks might want." Catherine nodded, digesting this information. The territorial governor's wife had warned her about frontier prejudices when Catherine had sought verification of Thomas's advertisement. "He's an Indian," the woman had said, "but he saved my husband's life once. Scouts for the railroad now. Keeps to himself." The town fell behind them as the wagon followed a dirt road winding through scrubland. Mountains rose in the distance, purple against the endless blue sky. Catherine had never seen such open space, such wild beauty. Boston, with its narrow streets and crowded buildings, seemed impossibly far away. "It's beautiful," she said, breaking the silence. Thomas glanced at her, as if checking whether she was being sincere. "Gets cold in winter, hot in summer. Spring brings floods sometimes." All places have their challenges, she replied. They traveled another mile in silence before he spoke again. Why did you come? Truth now. Catherine considered her answer carefully. My position at the school ended when the headmaster's niece needed employment. As an orphan without family connections, my options were limited. She smoothed her skirt. Your advertisement mentioned needing someone educated. You offered land, stability. I thought perhaps we might be of use to each other. Thomas nodded slowly. Practical. Yes. She hesitated. Your letter mentioned a proxy marriage for my protection. I appreciate that consideration. His expression darkened. Town like Broken Creek, unmarried woman living with a man, especially a man like me, wouldn't be safe. Paper makes it legal. Gives you rights to the land if something happens. Is something likely to happen? She asked, her stomach tightening. Thomas's eyes scanned the horizon. Been quiet lately, but Mayor's been talking about railroad expansion. New tracks need land. He glanced at her. My land. Catherine understood then that she had married not just a man, but his conflicts as well. She'd escaped one precarious situation only to enter another. Yet something about Thomas Crow's quiet dignity steadied her resolve. Then we shall have to make certain nothing happens to our land, she said firmly. Thomas looked at her with genuine surprise, the first unguarded expression she'd seen on his face. He said nothing, but as they continued toward their home, Catherine thought his shoulders seemed a fraction less burdened than before. The wagon crested a small rise, and Thomas's homestead came into view. Catherine tried to mask her reaction, but something must have shown on her face. Thomas's jaw tightened. Not what you expected, he said. Not a question. Catherine searched for the right words. It's more isolated than I imagined. The cabin stood alone in a small clearing, backed by cottonwood trees that followed what appeared to be a creek. A sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. It was neither as primitive as she'd feared nor as established as she'd hoped. A small barn stood nearby, along with what appeared to be the beginnings of another outbuilding. Creek never runs dry, Thomas offered as he halted the wagon. Good soil near the water. Started a garden last spring. Catherine nodded, noting the neat rows of what might be vegetables. At least he was practical. It's a good start, she said finally. Something that might have been relief flickered across his face. He helped her down from the wagon, careful not to touch more than her hand. Been alone a long time, he said gruffly. Place isn't fixed for a woman. I'm not afraid of work, Mr. Crow. Thomas, he corrected. Paper says we're married. Thomas, she repeated, testing the name. And I'm Catherine. He nodded once, then gathered her carpetbag and led her to the cabin door. A moment's hesitation, then he pushed it open and stepped aside. The interior was dim after the bright sunshine. Catherine blinked, letting her eyes adjust. A table and 2 chairs occupied one corner. A stone hearth dominated the far wall, cooking implements hanging nearby. A narrow bed with a simple frame stood against another wall, covered with a blanket woven in geometric patterns of red and black. You made that? She asked, gesturing to the blanket. Thomas shook his head. My mother's people. Apache way. He set down her bag. Not much, but it keeps the weather out. Catherine moved further into the cabin, noting the absence of decorative touches or comforts. No pictures on the walls, no cushions on the chairs. Yet, despite its sparseness, the cabin was meticulously clean. The wooden floor had been swept, the few dishes stacked neatly on a shelf. Where do you sleep? She asked, then felt heat rise to her cheeks at the impropriety of the question. Got a pallet in the barn. He gestured vaguely. You take the bed. Catherine nodded, relieved. Whatever arrangement they'd made on paper, they were still strangers. Thomas moved to a trunk against the wall and opened it, revealing several leather-bound books. He removed a thick ledger and set it on the table. Railroad work, he explained, opening the book to reveal detailed maps, notes in a careful hand, and sketches of landscapes. Scout for survey crews. Mark safe passages, water sources. Note trouble spots. Catherine leaned closer, impressed by the precision of his drawings and the clarity of his notations. "This is excellent work. You have a cartographer's eye." His expression suggested he wasn't familiar with the term. "A mapmaker," she clarified. "Your observations are very detailed." Thomas shrugged. "Need to be. Men die if I miss something." Catherine studied a page showing a mountain pass. Notes indicated water sources, game trails, and areas to avoid during certain seasons. The margin contained symbols she didn't recognize, perhaps Apache markings. "How did you come to this work?" she asked. Thomas's face closed. "Long story." He shut the ledger. "Need to see to the horse." Catherine watched him go, understanding she'd touched a sensitive area. Alone in the cabin, she opened her carpetbag and removed her few possessions. The dresses would need pressing, but that could wait. She placed her mother's Bible on the small table beside the bed. Her books on a rough shelf Thomas had mounted to the wall. Through the window, she watched him unhitch the horse, his movements efficient and gentle with the animal. 10 years alone, he'd said. What had happened to drive him to such isolation? The proxy marriage made practical sense for both of them, but Catherine couldn't help wondering what manner of man she tied herself to. Yet something about the careful order of his maps, the cleanliness of his modest home, and the gentle way he'd helped her from the train suggested a man of deeper character than the suspicious townsfolk might believe. Catherine straightened her shoulders. She had made her choice. Now she would make this work. Spotting a bucket near the door, she picked it up. Water would be the first necessity, then food. Small steps toward making the strange place feel like home. Catherine woke to unfamiliar sounds. Birdsong unlike any she'd known in Boston, the distant nickering of a horse, the soft rush of water over stones. For a moment, disorientation seized her. The rough-hewn beams above were not the plastered ceiling of her boarding house room. Then memory returned. The train, Thomas Crow, the proxy marriage certificate, her new life. She rose and dressed quickly in the cool morning air. The Apache blanket had kept her surprisingly warm through the night, its wool heavier and denser than any she'd known back east. Thomas had insisted she take the cabin while he slept in the barn. A gentleman in his way, despite what the townsfolk might think. Outside, the rising sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and amber. The mountains in the distance looked closer in the clear morning light. Thomas was already at work, splitting wood near what she now recognized as a smokehouse under construction. His movements were economical, each swing of the axe deliberate and precise. He paused when he noticed her, resting the axe against the chopping block. "Sleep well?" he asked, reaching for a shirt hanging from a nearby post. Catherine realized he'd been working bare-chested in the cool morning air. She averted her eyes, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "Yes, thank you." She smoothed her skirt, feeling suddenly formal and out of place in her Eastern attire. "I should start breakfast." Thomas nodded. "Coffee's on." "Made biscuits." Surprised, Catherine followed him to the outdoor fire pit, where a pot of coffee bubbled and a cast-iron skillet held several golden-brown biscuits. She hadn't expected him to cook. "You didn't need to?" "Been fending for myself a long time," he said, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "Nothing fancy." They sat on logs positioned around the fire pit. Catherine sipped the strong coffee, finding it bracing after her unsettled night. The biscuit was heavy but surprisingly tasty, clearly made from a practiced hand. "You didn't tell me much," Thomas said after a while, "about why you'd come all this way to marry a stranger." Catherine touched the locket at her throat, a reflexive gesture whenever conversations turned personal. "I told you, my position at the school." "There are other schools," he interrupted. "Other towns. Didn't have to come to Apache country." Catherine looked down at her cup. "My parents died when I was 16. Influenza. The school took me in, trained me as a teacher. But when they no longer needed my services," she shrugged. "I had few options. No family, limited funds." Thomas nodded slowly, and a half-breed Indian sounded better than nothing. There was no self-pity in his tone, just a statement of what he believed to be fact. Catherine's head snapped up. That is not true, she said firmly. Your letters were articulate. You offered land, stability. You were honest about your heritage and situation. She hesitated. The governor's wife spoke well of you. Surprise flickered across his face. You asked about me? Of course I did. I wouldn't travel halfway across the country without some assurance of your character. A silence fell between them, not entirely uncomfortable. Catherine opened her locket, revealing the small portraits inside. My parents, she explained, tilting it so Thomas could see. Father was a professor of literature. Mother taught piano. Thomas studied the miniature paintings with interest. Got your mother's eyes, he observed. Your father's chin. The assessment pleased her. What of your family? She asked carefully, testing whether the morning's peace might allow such questions. Thomas's face remained impassive, but he didn't withdraw. Mother was Chiricahua Apache. Father was an army surgeon. Met when he treated her brother. He took another biscuit. Unusual marriage. Didn't last. Father took me east for schooling when I was 10. Went back to my mother's people at 17. And they accepted you? A shadow crossed his face. Some did. Mother's brother taught me the old ways. How to track, hunt, speak to the earth. He stood abruptly. Need to check the garden. Catherine watched him go, understanding that each small revelation came at a cost. His past clearly held pain he was not yet willing to share. She looked down at the locket in her hand, at her parents' smiling faces. They had given her education, security, love. What had Thomas Crow's childhood given him beyond the skills to survive alone in this harsh country? The day stretched before her, full of tasks she had never performed in her sheltered Boston life. Yet as she tidied the breakfast things and prepared to explore her new home more thoroughly, Catherine felt a strange sense of possibility. This hardscrabble homestead could become something more. If they both were willing to try. 3 days later, Thomas announced they needed supplies. Catherine had taken inventory of the cabin's meager pantry and agreed they were low on essentials. The prospect of returning to Broken Creek filled her with both anticipation and dread. She yearned for human contact beyond Thomas's sparse conversation, yet their initial reception still stung. You don't have to come, Thomas offered as he hitched the wagon. Could be unpleasant. I am your wife, Mr. Crow, Catherine replied, adjusting her bonnet. At least according to the law. I won't hide away as if ashamed. Something like respect flickered in his eyes. As you wish. The ride to town passed in familiar silence. Catherine had quickly learned that Thomas spoke when necessary, but seldom for the sake of conversation. Instead, he occasionally pointed out features of the landscape. A hawk's nest, a patch of medicinal plants, the tracks of deer crossing their path. She found his observations more informative than the idle chatter she'd known in Boston parlors. Broken Creek appeared much as she remembered. Dusty, unwelcoming, wary of strangers. As they pulled up to the general store, Catherine noticed curtains twitching in windows, faces appearing and disappearing as townsfolk observed their arrival. Stay close, Thomas murmured, helping her down from the wagon. The storekeeper, a thin man with suspicious eyes, watched them enter without greeting. Catherine felt the chill in the air as Thomas handed her a small list. Need those, he said quietly. And whatever else you think we need. She nodded, understanding this division of labor. She would handle the domestic purchases while he sought other supplies. As she moved through the store, selecting flour, coffee, and salt, she noticed the storekeeper following her with his eyes, as if expecting theft. You're new, a woman's voice said behind her. Catherine turned to find a middle-aged woman in a practical dress studying her with undisguised curiosity. Mrs. Crow, isn't it? Yes, Catherine replied cautiously. Catherine Crow. Martha Wilson. My husband runs the trading post. The woman's expression was neutral, neither friendly nor hostile. You're a long way from home. This is my home now, Catherine answered with more conviction than she felt. Martha's eyebrows rose slightly. Is it? Well, that remains to be seen. She lowered her voice. Word of advice best to keep to yourselves. Thomas Crow has a history in these parts. Before Catherine could respond, the storekeeper approached. Found everything? He asked, his tone implying he hoped they hadn't. Yes, thank you, Catherine replied, maintaining her composure as she placed her items on the counter. The man tallied their purchases with exaggerated care, announcing a sum that seemed excessive. Catherine opened her mouth to object, but Thomas appeared at her side, placing coins on the counter without comment. That's too much, she whispered as they waited for their goods to be wrapped. Always is, Thomas replied quietly. For me. The storekeeper pushed their packages across the counter with barely concealed contempt. Catherine saw him note their purchases in a ledger, marking prices higher than those posted on the shelves. As they turned to leave, the door opened to admit a broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit. The atmosphere in the store instantly changed, the storekeeper straightening to attention. Mayor Hollister, he greeted. What brings you by today? The mayor's eyes fixed on Thomas and Catherine. Just checking on our newest resident, he said smoothly. Mrs. Crow, isn't it? Welcome to Broken Creek. His smile didn't reach his eyes, though I must say we were all surprised by Thomas's announcement. Didn't know he had marriage in mind when he placed that advertisement. The proxy marriage was for my protection, Mayor Hollister, Catherine replied evenly. A formality that benefits us both. Of course, of course. The mayor's gaze slid to Thomas. Always thinking ahead, aren't you, Crow? First the land claim, now a white wife. He shook his head. Quite the achievement for a man of your background. Thomas's face remained impassive, but Catherine felt the tension radiating from him. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, surprised by her own protectiveness. If you'll excuse us, Mayor, we have much to do at home, she said firmly. The mayor stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. By all means, though you should know, his voice followed them to the door. There's talk of the railroad needing to expand the line. Might affect properties north of town. Outside, Thomas loaded their purchases with controlled movements that betrayed his anger. Catherine waited until they were beyond the town limits before speaking. He was threatening us. Thomas nodded grimly. Been trying to get my land since I claimed it. Railroad's just his newest excuse. Can he take it? Not legally. Thomas glanced at her. But law works different out here, especially for Indians. Catherine considered this. The storekeeper overcharged us. Always does. Thomas's hands were steady on the reins. Why, I usually trade with Wilson instead. But he doesn't carry everything we need. Then we should grow more of our own food, Catherine said decisively. Expand the garden. Perhaps keep chickens. Thomas looked at her with genuine surprise. Thought you might want to go back, after seeing how things stand. Catherine met his gaze steadily. I don't run from bullies, Mr. Crow. Never have. For the first time, she saw the ghost of a real smile touch his lips. It transformed his face, softening the hard angles and bringing warmth to his dark eyes. Thomas, he reminded her. Thomas? She agreed, feeling something shift between them. The first foundation of true partnership. A week passed with Catherine settling into routines at the homestead. She'd taken charge of the garden, expanding the rows of vegetables with seeds she'd purchased in town. Thomas worked on the smokehouse, his strong hands crafting each piece with careful precision. They moved around each other with growing comfort, sharing meals and occasional conversation, yet maintaining a respectful distance. One afternoon, while Thomas was checking his trap lines, Catherine decided to properly clean the cabin. The small space was tidy but needed a woman's touch. She swept floors, washed the few dishes, and began organizing the single shelf of books. Behind a worn copy of Practical Surveying, she found a folded newspaper. Curious, she opened it to discover a section of advertisements, one circled in pencil. It read, Gentleman homesteader seeks correspondence with educated lady. Remote territory. Proxy marriage possible for mutual benefit. Inquire T. Crow, General Delivery, Broken Creek. The words were spare, practical, much like Thomas himself. Catherine sat on the edge of the bed, remembering her shock at finding such an advertisement in the Boston Gazette. She'd been desperate then, having received notice that her teaching position would end. With no family and limited savings, her options had narrowed to becoming a lady's companion or finding a husband. Neither prospect had appealed until this unusual advertisement caught her eye. The cabin door opened, and Thomas entered, carrying 2 rabbits for their supper. He stopped when he saw the newspaper in her hands. "Found my advertisement," he said, his tone neutral. Catherine nodded. "I was organizing." Thomas hung the rabbits outside and washed his hands in the basin before joining her. He sat at the table, regarding her with careful eyes. "Didn't expect anyone to answer," he admitted. "Especially not someone like you. Like me. Educated. Proper." He hesitated. "Beautiful." The compliment, delivered in his matter-of-fact way, warmed her unexpectedly. "Why did you place it?" she asked. Thomas looked away, his profile strong against the afternoon light from the window. "Land office said I needed to show proper development of my claim. Building improvements, growing crops." His fingers traced a pattern on the wooden table. "Told me a homestead needs a family to be considered permanent. So I'm just part of securing your claim?" Catherine tried to keep the hurt from her voice. "Started that way," he acknowledged. "Simple arrangement. You get security. I keep my land." He met her gaze. "Didn't expect you'd really come." Catherine smoothed the creased paper. "I had my reasons." "Running from something?" The directness of his question surprised her. "Not running. Surviving." She twisted the simple gold band on her finger, a ring Thomas had produced the day she arrived, explaining gruffly that appearances mattered. "The school where I taught was closing my position. Without family or connections, my prospects were limited." Thomas nodded slowly. "Hard for a woman alone." "Yes." Catherine looked down at the advertisement again. "Your letter mentioned you've been here 10 years. Why so long alone?" Thomas's face closed, the openness of moments before vanishing. He stood, moving to the door. "Need to dress those rabbits." "Thomas." Catherine's voice stopped him. "We're married, at least on paper. Eventually, you'll need to tell me what happened." He remained facing the door, his broad shoulders tense beneath his worn shirt. "Nothing good comes from digging up the past. Except understanding," she countered. "How can I know who you are if I don't know where you've been?" Thomas turned, his expression carefully controlled. "Who I was and who I am now ain't the same thing." "Then tell me who you are now." He seemed to consider this. Man trying to live quiet, build something that can't be taken away. His dark eyes held hers. Man who'll protect what's his. The intensity of his gaze made Catherine's breath catch. "And am I yours, Thomas? By more than just a paper marriage?" The question hung between them, bold in a way that would have been unthinkable in Boston society. Thomas's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You're here," he said simply. "That makes you part of this place. Part of what I protect." It wasn't a declaration of affection, yet Catherine found comfort in his words. This practical, reserved man offered security and purpose, perhaps in time more. Thomas moved toward the door again, then paused. "My wife, my first wife, died because of me," he said, his back to Catherine. "Because of choices I made. That's why I've been alone." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving Catherine with the newspaper in her hands and a new understanding of the man she'd married. Not just a stoic survivalist or a man fighting for his land, but someone carrying a burden of grief and guilt heavier than she'd imagined. Thomas's revelation about his first wife hung in the air between them in the days that followed. Catherine didn't press for details, understanding that his brief confession had cost him greatly. Instead, she focused on establishing herself in their shared life, learning the rhythms of the homestead and the land around it. One evening after supper, Catherine noticed Thomas struggling with a letter from the railroad company. He read slowly, his finger tracing each line, his brow furrowed in concentration. "May I help?" she offered carefully. Thomas looked up, his pride warring with practicality. Finally, he pushed the paper toward her. Legal words. Don't make sense to me. Catherine read the document, a notice about upcoming survey work near their property. They're planning to assess possible routes for a new spur line, she explained. This says they'll be working within 5 miles of here starting next month. Thomas nodded, absorbing this information. Could read it, just takes time. You read well, Catherine said truthfully, but legal language is deliberately complicated. He studied her for a moment. Could teach me better reading, if you wanted. The request, offered casually but with underlying vulnerability, touched her. I'd be happy to, she replied. I am a teacher, after all. The next evening they began. Catherine selected one of the simpler books from Thomas's shelf, a manual on tracking that combined basic text with illustrations. They sat side by side at the table, a single lamp between them as the desert night settled outside. Thomas was a determined student, his intelligence evident despite his limited formal education. When he struggled with a word, his frustration was visible only in the tightening of his jaw, never in complaint. You're doing well, Catherine encouraged after they'd read several pages. Your fundamentals are strong. Army doctor taught me basics, Thomas explained. My father said no son of his would be ignorant, even if I had Apache blood. The bitterness in his tone revealed old wounds. Catherine treaded carefully. And your mother? Did she value education too? Thomas's expression softened. Different kind. Taught me to read tracks, weather, plants. From a pouch at his belt, he withdrew a small beaded leather bag. Her medicine pouch. Gave it to me before I left for the white man's school. Catherine studied the intricate beadwork, geometric patterns in red, white, and black. It's beautiful. What's inside? Sacred things. Protection. He tucked it away. Your turn now. My turn. To learn. Thomas stood, gesturing for her to follow. Outside, the night sky blazed with stars, brighter than Catherine had ever seen in Boston. Thomas pointed upward. Can you find north? Catherine hesitated, then pointed uncertainly. There, Thomas smiled. A real smile that transformed his face. No. Look. He stood behind her, his arm extending alongside hers, pointing to a bright star. North Star. Always shows the way home. The warmth of him at her back, the gentleness of his guidance. It created an intimacy more profound than touch. Catherine felt her pulse quicken as he named constellations, explaining how the Apache saw patterns different from white men's charts. Tomorrow I'll show you plants, he said, stepping away as if suddenly aware of their proximity. What's safe to eat? What heals? I'd like that, Catherine replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Over the following days, they established a routine. Evenings were for reading lessons, mornings for Catherine to learn survival skills. Thomas showed her how to identify edible plants, how to follow game trails, how to listen to the wind for changing weather. Hold still, he instructed one morning, placing a knife in her hand. He stood behind her, adjusting her grip. Like this. Push away from your body, not toward. Catherine concentrated on the vegetable root he'd given her to peel, distracted by his nearness. The knife slipped, nicking her finger. I'm sorry, she began, embarrassed. Thomas took her hand without hesitation, examining the small cut. Not deep. He led her to the creek, kneeling to wash the wound with cool water. His touch was gentle, his calloused fingers incongruously tender against her skin. From his pocket he produced a leaf. Yarrow. Stops bleeding. He crushed it between his fingers and placed it on the cut, then bound it with a strip of clean cloth from his shirt. Thank you, Catherine said, oddly moved by his care. You've learned so much from this land. Thomas looked around at the scrubby hills, the distant mountains. Land teaches if you listen. He helped her to her feet. Like you listen to books. The simple comparison struck Catherine as profound. They were from different worlds with different knowledge, yet each had something to offer the other. For the first time, she laughed. a genuine sound of delight that startled them both. Thomas stared at her, then his lips curved in response. "What?" "Nothing," she said, still smiling. "I just realized I'm glad I came." His expression softened, the hardness of years alone briefly vanishing. "Good," he said simply. "I'm glad too." As they walked back to the cabin, a comfortable silence between them, Catherine realized something had shifted. This arrangement, begun as a practical solution to both their problems, was becoming something neither had anticipated. A true partnership, perhaps even the foundation of something more. 2 weeks after Catherine's arrival, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their midday meal. Thomas tensed immediately, his hand moving to the knife at his belt as he rose from the table. "Stay inside," he instructed, his voice reverting to the clipped tone of their first days together. Catherine watched through the window as a rider approached, a broad-shouldered man wearing a badge that caught the sunlight. The sheriff from Broken Creek. Thomas stood in the yard, waiting, his posture deceptively relaxed but his stance balanced for quick movement. The sheriff reined in his horse, looking down at Thomas with undisguised contempt. "Crow," he acknowledged. "Sheriff Davis," Thomas replied neutrally. "Something I can help you with?" "Thought I'd check on the new missus," Davis said, his gaze shifting to the cabin window where Catherine stood. "Make sure everything's proper out here." Catherine stepped outside, smoothing her apron. "Good afternoon, Sheriff. I'm Catherine Crow." She moved to stand beside Thomas, close but not touching. Davis studied her with narrowed eyes. "Ma'am, town's concerned about your situation out here." "My situation is perfectly satisfactory," Catherine replied evenly. "Is it?" The sheriff swung down from his horse. "No offense, ma'am, but decent white women don't usually take up with Indians, especially not educated ones like yourself." Thomas remained still, but Catherine felt the tension radiating from him. She lifted her chin. "I fail to see how my marriage is anyone's concern but our own. It's my concern when I get reports about a woman possibly being held against her will," Davis said, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered pistol. "Mayor thought I should check." "Mayor Hollister seems unduly interested in our affairs," Catherine observed. "I assure you, I am here by choice." The sheriff's gaze traveled over the modest homestead, the half-finished smokehouse, the expanded garden, the cabin with its new curtains visible through the window. "Nice improvements, Crow. Almost like you're planning to stay permanent." "It is permanent," Thomas said quietly. "Got the deed to prove it." "Deeds can be reconsidered." Davis kicked at the dirt, "especially when land's needed for progress. Railroads expanding, in case you hadn't heard." "We've received the survey notice," Catherine interjected. "The proposed routes are miles from here." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "Routes change, ma'am, especially when certain parties have influence." He looked directly at Thomas. "Mayor thinks you might be happier somewhere else. Maybe with your mother's people on the reservation." Catherine felt Thomas go completely still beside her. "My husband is a landowner with legal title," she said firmly. "He scouts for the railroad. His position and property are secure. For now." Davis turned back to his horse. "Just doing my duty, checking on a respectable lady living so remote." He swung into the saddle. "Town's having a social next Saturday. Mayor thought you might want to attend, Mrs. Crow. Meet some proper folk." "Thank you for the invitation," Catherine replied coldly. "We'll consider it." The sheriff tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "Do that. Might help folks understand your situation better." His gaze hardened as it shifted to Thomas. "Some people are wondering if you've got something to hide out here, Crow, keeping your wife isolated." Before Thomas could respond, Catherine took a deliberate step closer to him, her hand finding his. The contact surprised them both, but she didn't pull away. "My husband respects my wishes, Sheriff. I'm not isolated. I'm home." Something flickered in Davis's eyes. Surprise, perhaps even grudging respect. He nodded curtly and wheeled his horse around, kicking up dust as he rode away. Catherine released Thomas's hand once the sheriff was out of sight. "I'm sorry if I overstepped," she said quietly. But his insinuations were intolerable. Thomas was looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "You called me your husband. Not just on paper this time." Heat rose to Catherine's cheeks. "You are my husband, legally speaking, and I won't have anyone suggesting otherwise." He nodded slowly. "Thank you." The simple gratitude contained more emotion than any flowery speech. Catherine returned to the cabin, Thomas following. Inside, he paced the small space, his agitation evident. "Sheriff doesn't come out here without reason. Mayor's planning something." "Regarding the railroad?" Catherine asked. "Maybe." Thomas stopped pacing, his expression troubled. "Or maybe about you." "Me? White woman married to an Apache. Makes people uncomfortable." His jaw tightened. "Could make trouble for you in town." Catherine squared her shoulders. "I don't intimidate easily, Thomas." "Should." He faced her directly. "Woman like you with a man like me. Some folks won't ever accept it. Could get dangerous." "Woman like me?" Catherine echoed. "You mean educated?" "Eastern." "White," Thomas said bluntly. "Pure." Catherine felt a flush of indignation. "I'm not some delicate flower to be protected from the world's realities. And you are not." She faltered, then forged ahead. "Not someone I'm ashamed to stand beside." Something shifted in Thomas's eyes, surprise, followed by a warmth that transformed his stern features. Without thinking, Catherine reached for his hand again. This time, his rough fingers closed around hers, the touch sending an unexpected current through her. "We should attend that social," she said suddenly. Thomas stared at her. "What?" "The town social. We should go." Catherine's mind was working quickly. "If we hide away, it only fuels their suspicions. We need to show them we have nothing to conceal." Thomas shook his head. "Won't change their minds." "Perhaps not all of them," Catherine conceded. "But we might find allies." Mrs. Wilson seemed not entirely hostile. Thomas considered this, still holding her hand. "Could be walking into trouble. Or facing it directly," Catherine countered. "Together." Catherine woke to a sound like wounded animal. A low, keening moan that cut through the night silence. She sat up, disoriented in the darkness, before realizing the sound came from outside. Thomas, wrapping a shawl around her nightdress, she stepped onto the porch. Moonlight silvered the landscape, casting long shadows across the yard. Thomas sat on a fallen log near the cold fire pit, his head in his hands, shoulders hunched in a posture of defeat so at odds with his usual stoic strength that Catherine hesitated. "Thomas?" she called softly. His head jerked up, and for a moment he seemed not to recognize her. His eyes were haunted, distant, as if seeing something beyond the moonlit yard. "Go back inside," he said roughly. "I'm fine." Catherine moved closer instead. "You're not fine. You were." She paused, not wanting to say he'd been crying out in his sleep. "Having a nightmare, I think." Thomas looked away, his profile sharp against the night sky. "Old ghosts. Nothing for you to worry about." "I think it is," Catherine said gently, taking a seat beside him on the log. "We're married, Thomas. Your burdens are mine now too." He gave a bitter laugh. "You don't want my burdens." "Perhaps not," she agreed. "But I'm here, and you're suffering. Tell me." The silence stretched between them, filled with cricket song and the distant yip of coyotes. Finally, Thomas reached into his shirt and withdrew a folded paper. In the moonlight, Catherine could make out an official seal. "My discharge," he explained, "from scouting for the army." Catherine took it carefully, but couldn't read the faded text in the dim light. "Was good at it," Thomas continued, his voice low. "Too good, maybe. Knew the Apache ways, the hiding places. Helped the soldiers find renegade bands." His hands clenched. "My mother's people." Catherine's breath caught. "You were caught between two worlds." Thomas nodded. "Thought I was doing right. Preventing war. Saving lives on both sides." His voice dropped even lower. Army commander didn't care about saving Apache lives. Only wanted quick victories. What happened? Catherine asked, though part of her feared the answer. Found a small band. Women, children, few warriors. Reported back. Thomas's voice became mechanical, as if reciting facts that still didn't make sense to him. Commander ordered attack at dawn. I said they'd surrender peacefully if given the chance. He said, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Catherine's hand found his in the darkness. Oh, Thomas. I refused the order. Said I wouldn't lead a massacre. His fingers tightened around hers. Commander had me arrested for insubordination. Sent another scout. He drew a shuddering breath. They killed everyone. 18 people. Including my wife's sister. Her family. The enormity of his guilt washed over Catherine. But you tried to stop it. Didn't try hard enough, he said harshly. Should have warned them. Should have done something. What happened to your wife? Catherine asked softly, though she feared she knew. Mina was waiting at the fort. When she heard, his voice broke. Blamed me. Said I'd betrayed her people. My people. He stared into the darkness. She left. Went to find her brother's band. Army caught them crossing the river. Shot them all. Thomas, that wasn't your fault, Catherine whispered. Told the commander where to find her brother's favorite crossing, he said tonelessly. Months earlier. Information he remembered. Used. His breath hitched. My knowledge. My words. Got her killed. Catherine felt tears on her cheeks. So you came here. To be alone. Thomas nodded. Got my discharge. Army wanted me quiet about the massacre. Gave me land. Blood money. His bitter laugh held no humor. Started scouting for the railroad instead. Less killing. And you've been punishing yourself ever since, Catherine said. Living alone. Keeping to yourself. He didn't deny it. Dreams come less often now. But the sheriff, talking about the reservation, he shook his head. Brings it all back. Catherine sat with him in silence, processing the weight of his confession. This explained so much. His isolation, his reluctance to speak of the past, his wary relationship with the townspeople. Is that why they hate you? She asked finally. Because of what happened with the army? Partly, Thomas admitted. Some lost kin to Apache raids. Others just hate anything different. He looked at her. Why I warned you. Being with me puts you between worlds too. Catherine considered this. My father taught literature at the university, she said slowly. He believed understanding came from hearing all sides of a story. She squeezed Thomas's hand. I think he would have respected you, Thomas, for trying to bridge impossible divides. Thomas's breath caught. Don't deserve your kindness. It's not about deserving, Catherine said firmly. It's about moving forward. You've carried this alone long enough. The first light of dawn was beginning to pale the eastern sky. Thomas looked at their joined hands, then at the horizon. Sun's coming, he said, his voice steadier now. Yes, Catherine agreed. A new day. Something in her tone made him turn to study her face. Whatever he saw there seemed to ease some of the tension from his shoulders. Wordlessly, he helped her to her feet, and together they walked back toward the cabin. Their shadows merging in the growing light, Thomas's confession changed something between them. Though he remained a man of few words, the barrier of his past no longer stood between them. Catherine caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that might have been wonder, as if surprised by her continued presence after learning his darkest secret. A month into their marriage, Catherine sat at the table after breakfast, a small slate in her hands. She'd found it among her belongings, a relic of her teaching days. I've been thinking, she began, drawing Thomas's attention from the bridle he was mending. There must be children nearby who need education. Thomas's hands stilled. Nearest neighbors are 5 miles away. Peter's family. Do they have children? 4, Thomas confirmed. And the Wilsons from the trading post have 2. Couple of ranchers further out with young ones too. Catherine nodded, making calculations on her slate. That's at least 8 children without proper schooling. Thomas set the bridle aside. What are you planning? I'm a teacher, Thomas. This is what I know, what I'm trained for. She turned the slate toward him, showing her neat figures. I could teach here, perhaps 3 days a week. We could convert part of the barn, or build a simple schoolhouse. Thomas frowned. Town has a school, which likely wouldn't welcome children from outlying farms, especially not if their parents associate with us. Catherine's fingers traced the edge of the slate. Every child deserves education, regardless of where they live or who their parents know. Thomas studied her with that unreadable expression. Town won't like it. The town doesn't need to know, at least not initially, Catherine countered. We'd start small, just the closest families. Mayor would see it as challenging his authority. Teaching children to read isn't a political act, Catherine said firmly, though she understood his concern. Thomas shook his head. Everything's political out here, especially coming from us. Catherine set down the slate with a determined click. I need this, Thomas. I need to be useful, to practice my profession. She met his gaze directly. I didn't come all this way to simply keep house. Something like respect flickered in his eyes. Never thought you did. He considered for a long moment. Peter's family is struggling. Father lost an arm in a threshing accident last year. Might welcome help with the children. Hope rose in Catherine's chest. Would you speak to them? Could bring it up, Thomas allowed. Next time I'm over that way. Thank you. Catherine hesitated, then added, I thought perhaps you might help as well. Thomas looked genuinely surprised. With teaching? I'm barely educated myself. You know things I don't, Catherine said. Practical knowledge. Tracking, weather signs, natural history. She leaned forward earnestly. These children need both kinds of education to thrive here. Thomas seemed taken aback by her suggestion, but not displeased. You really think I could teach something worthwhile? I know you could, Catherine said firmly. I've learned more from you in a month than I learned from books in years. A hint of color touched Thomas's cheekbones, surprising her. He wasn't a man who blushed easily. I'll think on it, he said finally, returning to his bridal repair. But Catherine noted the slight curve of his lips as he worked. Not quite a smile, but close. 2 days later, Thomas returned from checking his traplines with news. Spoke to Wilson at the trading post. He's interested in your school idea. Said his wife's been worried about the children growing up without proper learning. Catherine looked up from the bread she was kneading, flour dusting her forearms. That's wonderful. Did he think the Peters family might be interested too? Already asked them, Thomas replied. His tone casual, though his eyes watched for her reaction. Stopping by tomorrow to discuss details. Catherine abandoned the bread, impulsively embracing Thomas in her excitement. He went rigid with surprise, then awkwardly patted her back, clearly unaccustomed to such displays. Sorry, she said, stepping back, embarrassed by her impulsiveness. I'm just pleased. Thomas cleared his throat. It's fine. After a pause, he added, Nice to see you happy. The simple statement warmed her more than elaborate compliments might have. This means a great deal to me, she admitted. Having purpose beyond our home. Thomas nodded. Thought it might. He hesitated. There's an Apache family too, living in the hills north of here. 3 children. Catherine's eyes widened. Would they come? Doubt it, Thomas said bluntly. Don't trust whites, but I could ask. Please do, Catherine urged. Every child deserves education. Thomas studied her. Even Indian children? Town would call that race mixing. The town's opinions matter very little to me, Catherine replied firmly. Knowledge belongs to everyone. A genuine smile transformed Thomas's face. You surprise me, Catherine Crowe. Good, she said, returning to her bread dough. I'd hate to be predictable. That evening, Thomas brought in what he'd been curing and began working at the table, his knife moving with practiced precision over the timber. What are you making? Catherine asked, curious at this new activity. Slate frames, he replied without looking up. Need proper equipment for a proper school. The simple gesture, his acceptance of her dream, his practical contribution, moved Catherine deeply. This man, so careful with his words, often spoke most clearly through his actions. "Thank you," she said softly. Thomas nodded, continuing his work as twilight deepened outside. They sat in comfortable silence, the rhythmic sound of his knife against wood a counterpoint to Catherine's quiet humming as she mended a shirt. For the first time, the cabin felt truly like a home to them both. Word spread quickly about Catherine's small school. Within 2 weeks, she had 11 students, the Peters and Wilson children, from outlying ranches, and to her delight, 2 Apache children whose father had cautiously agreed to Thomas's suggestion. They converted half the barn into a simple classroom, with benches Thomas crafted and a small blackboard Wilson procured from somewhere. Catherine taught reading, writing, and arithmetic in the mornings. In the afternoons, Thomas sometimes led the children on nature walks, teaching them to identify plants and animal tracks. The blend of traditional education and practical frontier knowledge seemed to engage even the most reluctant learners. Catherine was hanging student drawings when Thomas returned from town one afternoon, his expression darker than usual. "What is it?" she asked, recognizing the tension in his shoulders. He handed her a folded document. Mayor had this posted at the general store. Catherine unfolded the paper, recognizing the official letterhead of the territorial government. It appeared to be a notice regarding land claims, with specific language about proper documentation of continuous occupation and improvement. "I don't understand," she said, looking up at Thomas. "Your deed is valid, isn't it? Has been for 10 years. Thomas's jaw was tight. Notice says all landowners need to present original deeds for verification at the mayor's office within 30 days. Catherine frowned. That seems irregular. Why would established deeds suddenly need verification? Mayors creating problems where none exist. Thomas took the notice back, his fingers creasing the paper. Man at the store mentioned the railroads offering bounties for prime land along the proposed route. "But the route is miles from here," Catherine protested. "Routes can change." Thomas quoted Sheriff Davis's earlier warning. "Wilson says there's talk of a new spur line that would cut closer to our property." Catherine considered this. "Where is your deed?" "Locked box under the floorboards," Thomas replied. "Been safe there since I claimed the land." "We should make a copy," Catherine decided, "and perhaps have it verified by someone other than Mayor Hollister before presenting it to him." Thomas nodded, impressed by her strategic thinking. Wilson might know someone at the county seat, judge or lawyer who'd authenticate it. "Good." Catherine hung the last drawing. "There's something else bothering you. What is it?" Thomas hesitated. "2 men watching the place yesterday. Strangers. Didn't approach, just observed from the ridge." A chill ran through Catherine. "Do you think they were sent by the mayor? Or the railroad?" Thomas glanced toward the barn-turned schoolhouse. "Peters mentioned they asked him questions about us. About the school." "What kind of questions?" "Whether we were teaching Indian children alongside white ones." Thomas's expression hardened. "Whether you and I share a bed." Catherine flushed. Though legally married, they had maintained separate sleeping quarters. Thomas in the barn, Catherine in the cabin. An arrangement based on mutual respect and the newness of their relationship. "Our private life is no one's concern," she said firmly. "Becomes their concern when they're looking for excuses," Thomas countered. "Man and woman living together but not truly married? Could challenge the legality of our claim." Catherine's mind raced. "But we are legally married. The certificate could be questioned if they claim the marriage isn't real." Thomas met her gaze directly. "Proxy marriage is legal but unusual. Mayor could create problems." Catherine understood the implications. Their practical arrangement, initially based on mutual benefit, was now being scrutinized by hostile forces seeking any pretext to challenge their land claim. "What should we do?" she asked. Before Thomas could answer, hoofbeats approached. He moved to the window, hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. "Sheriff," he said grimly, "and 2 men I don't recognize." Catherine smoothed her apron, gathering her composure as Thomas went to meet the visitors. Through the window, she watched Sheriff Davis dismount, followed by two hard-faced men in expensive suits. The contrast between their fine clothing and the sheriff's worn uniform suggested they weren't local officials. "Mr. Crow," the sheriff called with false joviality. "Got some gentlemen here from the railroad. Want to discuss your property." Thomas stood firmly in the yard, neither inviting them closer nor approaching them. "My property isn't for discussion." The taller of the suited men stepped forward. "Thomas Crow? I'm James Barrett, acquisition agent for Western Pacific Railroad." He produced a document from his coat. "We have information that your land deed may have irregularities that could affect its validity." "Deed's sound," Thomas replied. "Registered and legal." Barrett smiled thinly. "That's to be determined. Mayor Hollister has raised some concerns about the documentation." His gaze shifted to Catherine as she emerged from the cabin. "And about the unusual nature of your household." Catherine moved to stand beside Thomas, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "There's nothing unusual about a husband and wife operating a small school for neighboring children, Mr. Barrett." "A school?" Barrett's eyebrows rose. "Without proper territorial authorization? Teaching mixed classes." His emphasis on the word left no doubt about his meaning. "Education knows no color," Catherine replied evenly. The second railroad man spat into the dust. "Told you, Barrett. Indian lover." Thomas stepped forward, his movement subtle but positioning himself between the men and Catherine. "State your business or leave my property." Barrett held out a folded paper. "Formal notice to produce your deed for inspection within 7 days. Not 30 as previously posted. Railroad has expedited the process due to urgent development needs." "Convenient timing," Catherine observed coldly. "Just business, ma'am." Barrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Railroad brings progress, opportunities, future." "We have a future here," Thomas said. "One we've built. One we'll defend." The threat in his quiet words was unmistakable. Sheriff Davis's hand moved to his gun belt. "Careful, Crow. Threatening railroad officials is a serious offense." "Not threatening," Thomas replied. "Stating fact." An uneasy silence fell. Catherine placed her hand on Thomas's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Gentlemen, we've received your notice," she said diplomatically. "We'll respond appropriately through legal channels." Barrett nodded curtly. 7 days, Crow. After that, we'll proceed with or without your cooperation." After the railroad men departed, Thomas retrieved the deed from its hiding place, a metal box beneath a loose floorboard under their bed. The yellow document bore official territorial seals and signatures, appearing entirely legitimate to Catherine's eye. "We need legal counsel," she said, studying the complex language. "Someone who can't be influenced by Mayor Hollister or the railroad." Thomas carefully refolded the deed. Wilson suggested his brother-in-law in the county seat. "Former judge. Honest by all accounts." "We should go tomorrow," Catherine decided, "before their 7-day deadline." Thomas nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Won't be that simple. Mayor's determined. Railroad has money and influence." "Then we need allies," Catherine said firmly. "Other landowners who might face similar threats." Before they could discuss further, a wagon approached, Samuel Peters and his wife Ruth, with their 4 children in the back. Thomas tensed until he recognized them. "Unusual time for a visit," he murmured, going to meet them. Samuel Peters climbed down awkwardly, his empty sleeve pinned at the shoulder, a reminder of his threshing accident. "Crow," he greeted, his weathered face grave. "Mrs. Crow, got word about the railroad men coming your way." "News travels fast," Thomas observed. "Wilson sent his boy to warn us," Ruth Peters explained, helping her children from the wagon. "Said you might need support." Catherine felt a surge of gratitude. The Peters family had been reserved when first bringing their children to the school, clearly uncomfortable with Thomas's heritage. This visit suggested a significant shift. "We're grateful," she said warmly. "Please, Come inside. As Ruth organized the children with practiced efficiency, Samuel spoke quietly to Thomas. Railroad approached us last month, offered to buy our place. When I refused, they found problems with our deed too. Thomas's expression darkened. Same pattern. Not just us, Samuel continued. Johnson's and Miller's too. All smallholders along the proposed route. He glanced at his wife. Ruth thought we should stand together. Strength in numbers. Inside the cabin, Catherine served coffee to the adults while the children played outside under the watchful eye of the Peters' oldest daughter. Ruth produced a cloth-wrapped bundle from her basket. Brought this, she said, unfolding a handmade quilt in vibrant colors. Been working on it since you started teaching our little ones. Meant it as a thank you, but seems it might serve as something more now. The quilt was beautifully crafted, with squares contributed by different hands. Some skilled, others clearly the work of children. In the center was stitched, Broken Creek Homesteaders. United we stand. It's beautiful, Catherine said, genuinely moved. Every family with children in your school added a square, Ruth explained. Even Two Hawk's wife. She did that one with the Thunderbird pattern. Catherine touched the square representing the Apache family, deeply touched by this symbol of unlikely unity. Wilson's organizing a meeting, Samuel explained. Tomorrow evening at the trading post. All the families affected by the railroad's plans. He looked at Thomas. Thought you might have insights, being as you've worked for them. Thomas considered this. Know how they operate. Might help. We'll be there, Catherine assured them. And we'll bring the deed for everyone to examine. Perhaps together we can find a solution. After the Peters family departed, promising to return for school the following week regardless of the railroad's pressure, Catherine and Thomas sat in thoughtful silence. Didn't expect that, Thomas finally said. The Peters. The quilt. People can surprise you, Catherine replied, running her fingers over the colorful fabric. When faced with a common threat. Or a common purpose, Thomas added, glancing toward the barn schoolhouse. Your teaching brought these families together. Catherine shook her head. Our teaching, she corrected. The children talk about your nature lessons at home. You've earned their parents' respect. Thomas seemed uncomfortable with the praise but didn't dismiss it. Progress, Catherine thought. The next evening, they arrived at Wilson's trading post to find it already crowded with families. The Peters, Johnsons, and Millers that Samuel had mentioned, plus several others Catherine recognized from school visits. To her surprise, Two Hawks and his wife Standing Fawn were present, staying near the door but definitely part of the gathering. Wilson greeted them warmly. Brought the deed. Thomas nodded, patting his jacket pocket. Good. Wilson addressed the room. Folks, we all know why we're here. Railroads trying to bully us off land that's rightfully ours. Murmurs of agreement followed. Thomas and Catherine have been first in their sights, likely because the mayor has a particular dislike for them. But make no mistake, we're all vulnerable if they succeed. An older man Catherine didn't recognize spoke up. What can we do? They've got money, lawyers, the mayor in their pocket. We have something too, Catherine said, stepping forward. Though normally reserved in groups, the teacher in her took over. Knowledge, community, and legal rights. She outlined what they knew of the railroad's tactics, then suggested a plan, documenting each family's legal claim, preparing collective evidence of continuous occupation and improvement, and sending a delegation to the territorial capital if necessary. Mrs. Crow's right, Wilson affirmed. But we need more. We need to present a united front. No individual deals with the railroad. All for one or none at all. The families exchanged glances, then one by one, nodded agreement. There's something else, Thomas said quietly, speaking for the first time. All eyes turned to him. Mayor and railroad are using divisions against us. White against Indian. Newcomer against old-timer. Town against homesteaders. His gaze swept the room. Won't work if we don't let it. Standing Fawn, Two Hawk's wife, stepped forward with dignity. My husband says your school teaches all children as equals. This is good. Her English was accented but clear. "We will stand with you if you stand with us." In that moment, looking at the diverse faces united by common purpose, Catherine felt a surge of hope. They had found allies where least expected, building a community that transcended the divisions others would use against them. Wilson's idea was bold. A harvest gathering at the trading post, open to all homesteaders and even townspeople. "Show them we're not afraid," he explained, "and that we're a community worth preserving." The evening of the gathering arrived crisp and clear, with an autumn moon rising full above the distant mountains. Catherine stood before the small mirror in their cabin, pinning her hair more carefully than usual. She'd worn her best dress, a deep blue that brought out her eyes, one of the few fine things she'd brought from Boston. Thomas entered, then stopped abruptly in the doorway. He'd bathed in the creek and wore a clean shirt, his dark hair tied back neatly. For a moment he simply looked at her. "You're beautiful," he said finally, the words coming out gruff but sincere. Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. After 2 months of marriage, they had developed a comfortable partnership, but moments of personal admiration remained rare and precious. "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy. "You look very handsome yourself." Thomas shifted uncomfortably but seemed pleased. From his pocket, he produced something small and silver. "Thought you might want this. For your hair." Catherine took it carefully. A delicate silver hairpin with a turquoise stone set at one end. "Thomas, it's exquisite." "Was my mother's," he explained. "One of the few things I kept. Apache women wear them for special occasions." The significance of the gift left Catherine momentarily speechless. This was no mere ornament but a piece of his heritage, his past now offered to her. "I'm honored," she said softly, turning to the mirror to place it carefully in her upswept hair. "Truly." Thomas watched her, something unreadable in his expression. "Suits you," he said simply. They rode to the trading post in a comfortable silence, the evening air fragrant with sage and pine. Lanterns illuminated the yard where Wilson had cleared space for dancing. Already, several families had arrived, the Peters, the Johnsons, and to Catherine's delight, 2 Hawks and his family, standing somewhat apart but definitely present. Wilson greeted them warmly. "Fine evening for a gathering," he said, winking at Catherine, "and perhaps a statement to certain parties who thought to divide us." Catherine followed his subtle nod toward the edge of the gathering, where Mayor Hollister stood with Sheriff Davis and the railroad men, Barrett and his associate. Their presence was clearly meant to intimidate, but the homesteaders carried on with deliberate cheer. "Don't let them spoil the evening," Martha Wilson advised, appearing at Catherine's side. "They're hoping for trouble. Let's disappoint them." A fiddle struck up a lively tune, joined by a guitar and someone tapping rhythm on a wooden box. Couples formed for dancing, Samuel Peters leading his wife despite his missing arm, the Johnsons taking the floor with practiced steps. "Dance with your wife, Thomas," Wilson encouraged. "Show them what we're celebrating." Thomas looked uncomfortable. "Don't know these dances." "I'll teach you," Catherine offered impulsively, holding out her hand. After a moment's hesitation, Thomas accepted. Catherine guided him to the edge of the dancing area, where she showed him the basic steps of the simple reel. He followed with surprising grace for a man unaccustomed to dancing, his natural physical awareness translating well to the rhythm. "You're a quick study," she observed as they joined the main circle. "Good teacher," he returned, the hint of a smile touching his lips. As they moved through the figures of the dance, Catherine became aware of eyes upon them, not just the mayor and his associates, but everyone present. The Apache scout and his Eastern bride, dancing together in defiance of convention. 2 Hawks and Standing Fawn watched with particular interest. When the music ended, Thomas led Catherine toward the refreshment table. Before they reached it, they were intercepted by an elderly Apache man Catherine hadn't seen before. "Grandson," he greeted Thomas in heavily accented English. "It has been many seasons." Thomas stiffened, then inclined his head respectfully. "Grandfather, didn't expect to see you here. 2 Hawks said I should come. See my grandson's new life." The old man's gaze shifted to Catherine. See his new wife. Catherine, this is my mother's father, Grey Wolf, Thomas introduced. Elder of her band. Catherine offered her hand in the white way, then remembered and switched to a respectful nod. I'm honored to meet you. Grey Wolf's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. You wear Apache silver, he observed, nodding to the hairpin. My daughter's work. Thomas gave it to me, Catherine explained. I'm deeply honored to wear it. The old man studied her a moment longer, then turned to Thomas. You have chosen a woman of courage, he said in Apache, the words unintelligible to Catherine but clearly meaningful to Thomas, whose posture relaxed slightly. She chose me, Thomas replied in English, with a glance at Catherine that contained something new, a warmth that transcended mere partnership. After Grey Wolf moved away to speak with two hawks, Thomas explained. He says he's watched from a distance, knows about the school, the railroad's threats. He seemed both surprised and moved. Says our fight is his fight too. Family, Catherine said softly. Thomas nodded, the word clearly significant. Family. From across the gathering, Mayor Hollister watched their interaction with obvious displeasure. When the music began again, he approached, his smile a thin veneer over clear hostility. Mrs. Crow, he said with exaggerated courtesy, might I have this dance? As mayor, I should welcome all new residents personally. Before Catherine could respond, Thomas stepped slightly forward. My wife promised this dance to me, he said quietly but firmly. The mayor's smile hardened. Another time, perhaps, though I wonder how much longer you'll be residents to welcome. He nodded toward Barrett, who raised his glass in mocking salute. Railroad doesn't take kindly to obstacles. Neither do we, Catherine replied evenly. As the mayor withdrew, Thomas led Catherine back to the dancing area. This time, he moved with more confidence, holding her closer than the dance strictly required. Catherine felt the solid strength of him, the security of his presence. Thank you, she said as they turned. For what? For claiming me so clearly. Her eyes met his. For being a true husband tonight. Something shifted in Thomas's gaze. A deepening, a decision. Not just tonight, he said quietly. If you'll have me. The simple statement contained a world of meaning. Their paper marriage, begun for practical reasons, had become something neither had anticipated. Something real. I will, Catherine replied, her heart suddenly light as autumn leaves dancing in the wind. Catherine woke to the smell of smoke. For a moment, she thought Thomas had started the morning fire early, but the acrid scent was too strong, too wrong. She sat up, heart pounding. Thomas? She called. Since the dance 3 nights ago, he had moved from the barn to the cabin, sharing the small space though still maintaining his propriety by sleeping on a pallet near the fireplace. He was already up, pulling on his boots. Stay here, he ordered, his voice tense. Catherine ignored the instruction, hastily donning her wrapper and following him outside. The dawn light revealed the source of the smoke. The small schoolhouse was ablaze, flames consuming the wooden structure they'd so carefully built. No, Catherine cried, instinctively moving toward it. Thomas caught her arm. Too late, he said grimly. Structure's gone. They watched in helpless silence as the fire devoured their work. Books, slates, the children's drawings, all consumed in angry orange flames. When the roof collapsed with a terrible groan, Catherine turned her face into Thomas's shoulder, unable to watch. Who would do this? She whispered. Thomas's body was taut with controlled fury. Same men who want our land. As the fire burned itself out, leaving only smoking ruins, Thomas carefully examined the ground around the schoolhouse. Catherine followed, her initial shock giving way to a cold anger. Deliberate, Thomas confirmed, pointing to tracks in the dirt. 2 men came on horseback. He knelt, examining a patch of churned earth. Poured coal oil around the foundation. Made sure it would burn fast. Catherine surveyed the devastation, her educator's heart breaking at the sight of charred books and melted slates. A flash of color caught her eye, a partially burned alphabet chart she'd so carefully lettered for the youngest children. "They'll pay for this," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening. Thomas straightened, his face hard as granite. "Yes, they will." He turned toward the cabin, his purpose evident in his stride. Catherine hurried after him, alarmed by the cold fury in his eyes. "Thomas, wait. What are you planning?" Inside, he went directly to the trunk where he kept his hunting rifle. The weapon hadn't left its case since Catherine's arrival. Thomas preferred his knife and bow for hunting, claiming they were quieter and more reliable. "Going to track them," he said, checking the rifle's action. "Find who did this." "And then what?" Catherine pressed, fear replacing her anger. "Confront them? Alone?" "Done being passive," Thomas replied, loading cartridges with methodical precision. "Done letting them take what's ours." Catherine placed her hand on the rifle barrel, forcing him to look at her. "This is what they want," she said urgently, "to provoke you into something rash. Something that would justify their worst accusations about violent Indians." Thomas's jaw clenched. "What would you have me do? Nothing? Let them burn what we build, threaten what's ours, and just accept it?" "No," Catherine said firmly. "I want justice too, but not revenge. Not violence that would cost us everything." "Apache way would be clear," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. "Man who burns another's shelter forfeits his own protection." "We're not living solely by Apache ways," Catherine countered, "nor solely by white man's law. We're finding our own path, together." She moved closer, placing her palm against his cheek. The gesture, their first truly intimate touch, startled him enough to break through his anger. "Thomas, please, there are children counting on us. Families who've allied with us. We can't abandon them by doing something that would play into the mayor's hands." Conflict warred in his expression, the instinct for direct action battling with the wisdom of her words. Finally, he set the rifle down, though his body remained tense with restrained fury. "What then?" he asked. "Let them destroy everything we build?" "No," Catherine replied. "We rebuild. We document what happened. We bring witnesses, Wilson, the Peters, 2 Hawks. We make formal complaints to the territorial authority, not just the mayor's office." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. "Paper protests, while they act." "And we act too," Catherine insisted, "but smartly, in ways they don't expect." She moved to the table, taking paper and pencil. "First, we document everything. The tracks, the evidence of deliberate burning. Then we inform all our school families what happened and why." Her pencil moved quickly across the paper. "We hold classes in our cabin until we can rebuild. We show them that they cannot stop education with fire." Thomas watched her, the worst of his rage gradually subsiding. "They'll try again." "Probably," Catherine acknowledged. "But each time they do, they reveal themselves more clearly. And we'll be ready." A knock at the door interrupted them. Wilson stood outside, his normally jovial face grim. "Heard about the fire," he said. "Sheriff's in town saying it was probably an accident. Coal oil lamp left burning." His disgust was evident. "Came to offer the back room of the trading post for your school. Temporary, till you rebuild." Catherine felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson." "Not just me," Wilson replied. "Peters and Johnson are bringing lumber from their own supplies. 2 Hawks offered to help build. Folks are angry about this, Catherine." "Thomas." Thomas looked surprised at this show of solidarity. "Why? Not their fight." "Became their fight when they sent their children to your school," Wilson said simply. "When they stood with you against the railroad." He gestured toward the smoldering ruins. "This wasn't just an attack on you. It was an attack on all of us who've chosen to stand together." As Wilson departed, promising to return with others to help clear the debris, Thomas turned to Catherine. "Still want to track them," he admitted. "Find who did this." "I know," she said gently. "But we need you here helping rebuild. Showing everyone that we won't be driven away by intimidation." Thomas glanced at the rifle, then back to the burned schoolhouse visible through the window. Finally, he nodded. "Your way, then," he conceded. For now. Catherine recognized the compromise for what it was, not surrender but a choice to follow her lead in this instance. The partnership they were building day by day, decision by decision. "Our way," she corrected softly. "Together." The schoolhouse rebuilding began immediately. Homesteaders arrived with lumber, tools, and willing hands. Even 2 Hawks brought members of his band to help, their skilled work advancing the construction rapidly. Catherine continued teaching in Wilson's back room, refusing to let a single day of education be lost to intimidation. Thomas threw himself into the rebuilding with focused energy, channeling his anger into constructive action. Catherine watched him work alongside men who, just weeks earlier, would have shunned him. The shared purpose had bridged divides she once thought impassable. A week after the fire, as the new schoolhouse neared completion, Sheriff Davis rode up to their homestead. Thomas straightened from setting a window frame, his face impassive as the lawman approached. Davis said simply, "Could get unpleasant." Mayor mentioned concerns about mixed-race schooling, improper living arrangements, possible incitement of Indian unrest. He glanced meaningfully at the Apache workers helping with the construction. "Lot of charges could complicate your situation." "Are you threatening us, Sheriff?" Catherine asked directly. Davis adjusted his hat. "Just delivering information, ma'am. Mayor's offering a generous solution to a difficult situation." Thomas handed the eviction notice back. "Not accepting this. Land is legally mine. Suit yourself." Davis remounted his horse. 7 days, Crow. Then I come back with deputies." He turned his horse, then paused. "Shame about the schoolhouse fire. Never did find who was responsible." After he rode away, Thomas studied the document, his jaw tight. "Notice is falsified," he said finally. "Signature doesn't match the territorial governor's on my original deed." Catherine took the paper, examining it carefully. "You're right. And the seal is different too." Her mind raced. "Thomas, this isn't even legal. It's a forgery." "Won't matter if they force us off the land," he replied grimly. Catherine paced the yard, thinking rapidly. "We need to prove the forgery, and we need leverage against the mayor." Thomas nodded. Wilson mentioned records in the town hall. Tax documents, land transactions. Records that might show the mayor's interest in railroad deals? Catherine suggested. "Worth looking into," Thomas agreed. "But town hall's always locked. Sheriff keeps the keys." "I could create a distraction," Catherine offered. "During the town council meeting tomorrow, while everyone's occupied, you could examine the records." Thomas shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. If you were caught—" "I won't be," Catherine insisted. "I'll simply request to address the council about educational matters, as is my right as a resident." Thomas studied her, respect and concern warring in his expression. "They won't listen." "I don't expect them to," Catherine replied with a small smile. "I just need them to watch me instead of you." That evening, as they reviewed their plan, a knock came at the door. Thomas answered cautiously, relaxing slightly when he recognized 2 Hawks. "Brother," the Apache greeted him, "my father wishes to speak with you and your wife." Gray Wolf waited outside, dignified despite his advanced years. "Grandson," he acknowledged Thomas, "the spirits told me you face enemies who hide behind paper weapons." Thomas invited him inside, where the elder studied the forged eviction notice with knowing eyes. "White man's tricks," he observed, "using their own laws against you." "Yes," Catherine agreed. "We plan to find evidence of their deception." Gray Wolf nodded approvingly. "Good, but you will need protection." From a pouch at his waist, he withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. "For you, grandson. Your mother would want you to have it." Thomas unwrapped the bundle to reveal a hunting knife with an intricately carved bone handle. His breath caught. "This was my father's gift to her when they married. Now it protects their son and his chosen wife," Gray Wolf said solemnly. "When you face your enemies, carry both white man's paper and Apache steel. After the elder departed, Thomas sat turning the knife in his hands, emotion evident in his usually stoic features. "It's beautiful," Catherine said softly. "More than that," Thomas replied. "It's acceptance. From my mother's people." Catherine placed her hand over his. "Your family is growing again, Thomas. After all these years alone." He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "Because of you. Your courage brought us here." "Our courage," she corrected gently. "And we'll need all of it tomorrow." Thomas carefully set the knife aside and drew her closer. "Whatever happens, Catherine, with the land, the school, all of it, know that you've given me something I'd lost hope of finding." "What's that?" she asked, though something in his eyes told her the answer. "A reason to fight," he said simply. "A future worth defending." In the quiet of their cabin, with the newly rebuilt schoolhouse visible through the window and the threats of their enemies temporarily at bay, Catherine leaned into her husband's embrace. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and danger, but tonight they had this moment of connection. A partnership forged in adversity and strengthened by shared purpose. The Broken Creek Town Hall stood imposingly at the center of Main Street, its pretentious architecture meant to evoke Eastern governance rather than frontier practicality. Catherine climbed the steps alone, her posture straight and determined despite the churning in her stomach. Inside her reticule was a small law book she'd brought from Boston, a text on property rights that had belonged to her father. Thomas would enter through the rear once the council meeting began, using the distraction of her presentation to access the records room. The plan was simple but dangerous. Discovery could mean arrest for both of them. "Mrs. Crow," Mayor Hollister greeted her with evident surprise as she entered the council chamber. "What brings you to town?" "I've come to address the council regarding educational matters," Catherine replied evenly. "As is my right as a resident." The mayor's eyes narrowed. "We have a formal agenda, which allows for public comment," Catherine interrupted, drawing on her knowledge of civic procedures. "I've reviewed your posted bylaws." Hollister's face tightened, but he nodded curtly. "Very well. You may have 5 minutes after official business concludes." Catherine took a seat at the back of the room, aware of the curious stares from townspeople unaccustomed to seeing women at council meetings. Sheriff Davis watched her with particular suspicion, clearly wondering why she had come alone. The meeting dragged through mundane matters: road repairs, water rights, taxes. Catherine noted that several agenda items involved railroad interests, with Hollister consistently advocating positions that would benefit Western Pacific. Finally, after nearly an hour, the mayor reluctantly acknowledged her. "Mrs. Crow wishes to address the council regarding educational matters," he announced with poorly concealed impatience. 5 minutes, Mrs. Crow." Catherine approached the front of the room, her law book conspicuous in her hands. "Gentlemen, I come before you not only as an educator but as a concerned citizen of this territory." She opened the book to a marked page. "I've been reviewing territorial statutes regarding property rights and public education. Several interesting points have come to my attention." The council members shifted uncomfortably as she began citing specific legal codes. First regarding the right to education for all children regardless of race or background, then transitioning to property law and the requirements for legal seizure of private land. "Most concerning," she continued, her voice clear and authoritative, "are the penalties for falsifying official documents, particularly eviction notices." She turned to a new page. Section 42 states that any official who knowingly produces or delivers fraudulent government documents is subject to immediate removal from office and criminal prosecution. Mayor Hollister's face had gone from impatient to alarmed. "Mrs. Crow, this is hardly relevant to educational matters." "On the contrary," Catherine countered, "education extends beyond the schoolhouse. It includes teaching our citizens and our officials about the law and its proper application." Sheriff Davis had risen, moving toward the side door, the one that led to the records room. Catherine raised her voice slightly. "I've taken the liberty of sending copies of the fraudulent eviction notice delivered to my husband, along with expert analysis of the forged signatures and seal, to the territorial governor's office." This was a bluff, but delivered with such conviction that uncertainty flickered across Hollister's face. "That's enough, Mrs. Crow," the mayor snapped. "Your time is up." Catherine closed her book. "I've also requested an investigation into certain financial arrangements between town officials and the Western Pacific Railroad." The governor seemed particularly interested in that aspect. The room erupted in murmurs. A council member leaned toward Hollister, whispering urgently. The mayor's complexion had turned florid. "These are serious allegations, Mrs. Crow," he blustered. "Without evidence—" "Evidence exists in abundance," Catherine replied confidently, praying that Thomas had found what they needed. "More than you might imagine." Sheriff Davis had disappeared through the side door. Catherine's heart raced, knowing Thomas might be discovered at any moment. "This meeting is adjourned," Hollister declared, banging his gavel with unnecessary force. "Mrs. Crow, I suggest you consider the consequences of slander before making such outrageous claims." As the room cleared, Catherine remained standing at the front, deliberately taking her time gathering her things. She needed to create more time for Thomas to escape. "Impressive performance," a deep voice commented from the doorway. Catherine turned to find James Barrett, the railroad agent, watching her with calculated interest. Though ultimately futile. "I disagree, Mr. Barrett," she replied coolly. He approached, his expensive suit and confident manner designed to intimidate. "Your husband's land will be railroad property within the week. Your theatrical display changes nothing." "Perhaps," Catherine allowed. "Or perhaps you underestimate what people will do to protect their homes." Barrett smiled thinly. "People like you don't belong out here, Mrs. Crow. Too civilized. Too educated." He glanced meaningfully at her law book. "Too Eastern. This territory belongs to those willing to do what's necessary." "On that point we agree," Catherine replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "And I assure you, Mr. Barrett, I am entirely willing." Something in her tone gave him pause. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway, shouts, the sound of running feet. Catherine's heart sank. Had Thomas been caught? Sheriff Davis burst into the room. "Barrett, your men are fighting with some Apache down by the creek. 2 Hawks and his people." Barrett cursed. "Diversion tactics. The savages are working with Crow." He turned to Catherine, comprehension dawning. This whole charade was a distraction. Catherine maintained her composure with effort. "I have no idea what you mean." As Barrett and Davis rushed from the building, Catherine forced herself to walk calmly toward the exit. Outside, she could see a commotion near the creek that ran behind the town hall. Several Apache men appeared to be in a heated dispute with railroad workers. 2 Hawks was at the center, his voice carrying across the distance. Catherine slipped down a side alley, heart pounding. Their plan had called for a quiet exit, not this confrontation. Had Thomas been forced to seek 2 Hawks' help? "Catherine!" She nearly cried out as Thomas materialized from the shadows, pulling her deeper into the alley. "What happened?" she whispered urgently. "Found what we needed," he replied, patting his jacket where papers were concealed. "Sheriff nearly caught me. 2 Hawks was watching. Created a diversion." "Is he in danger?" she asked, concerned for their ally. "No. Arguing about fishing rights. Nothing illegal." Thomas guided her toward the edge of town where they'd left their wagon. "You were magnificent." Heard every word from the records room window. Catherine felt a rush of relief mingled with pride. "Did you find evidence of the mayor's corruption?" Thomas nodded, a rare smile transforming his face. "More than expected. Land sale agreements, railroad kickbacks, forged documents. Even a letter about arranging the schoolhouse fire. Enough to take to the territorial governor? Enough to bury Hollister and the railroad's plans," Thomas confirmed. "But not safe here anymore. Need to leave immediately for the territorial capital." Catherine hesitated. "You should stay with the homestead. Protect our land. I can take the evidence." Thomas stared at her in disbelief. "Alone? 3 days' travel through open country." "I'm not helpless, Thomas," she reminded him. And they'll be watching you, not me. Too dangerous, he insisted. Necessary, she countered. Our home needs defending, and you're the one to do it. I can handle this mission. She touched his arm gently. Trust me as I trust you. The internal struggle was visible on his face, his instinct to protect her warring with the logic of her argument. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. Take Wilson's fastest horse, he said. Travel only by day. Stay on the main road. Catherine nodded, heart pounding at the enormity of the task ahead. I'll leave at first light. As they slipped out of town, the commotion at the creek still providing cover, Catherine realized how far she'd come from the proper Boston schoolteacher who had arrived just months ago. The frontier had changed her, as had her marriage to this complex man. She was stronger now, more determined, and she would need every ounce of that strength for the journey ahead. 5 days passed with agonizing slowness. Thomas maintained his daily routines, tending animals, checking trap lines, teaching the children who still came for lessons, all while watching the road for signs of Catherine's return or the sheriff's threatened eviction party. On the 6th morning, Thomas spotted dust on the horizon, multiple riders approaching fast. He called to Wilson and Samuel Peters, who had come to help fortify the homestead. They're coming, he said simply. Wilson shaded his eyes. 6, maybe 7 men. Sheriff's posse. Thomas nodded grimly. And railroad men. He could make out Barrett's distinctive gray horse among the approaching riders. Catherine, Peters asked, voicing the concern they all shared. No sign yet. Thomas checked his rifle, then tucked his hunting knife, Gray Wolf's gift, into his belt. Get inside. Both of you. Wilson shook his head. We stand together, Thomas. That was the agreement. Before Thomas could argue, more movement caught his eye, riders approaching from the east, the direction of Two Hawks' camp. The Apache elder himself led a small group of his people, their arrival time to coincide with the sheriff's approach. Seems your father-in-law had the same idea, Wilson observed wryly. Thomas felt a surge of emotion at this show of solidarity from his mother's people. They took positions nearby, not threatening but unmistakably present. Sheriff Davis reined in his horse 20 yards from the cabin, his deputies and the railroad men fanning out behind him. Mayor Hollister was conspicuously absent. Time's up, Crow, Davis called. Got the final eviction order here. Legal and binding. Thomas stepped forward, careful to keep his hands visible and away from his weapons. Not leaving my land, Sheriff. Barrett moved his horse alongside Davis. This doesn't need to be difficult. We're authorized to offer $15,000 now. Last chance for you to walk away rich instead of in chains. Not for sale, Thomas replied. At any price. The sheriff signaled, and his deputies dismounted, hands resting on their sidearms. Don't make this ugly, Crow. You've got women and children to think about. Thomas noted the deliberate attempt to provoke him by referencing his family. He remained stone-faced. Only ugly if you make it so. Davis's patience visibly thinned. I've got legal authority to remove you and seize this property. Stand aside or face arrest. Your authority is counterfeit, Thomas replied evenly. Like the documents you delivered. The sheriff dismounted, hand moving to his gun. That's enough. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and inciting unrest. His gaze shifted to Two Hawks and his people. Bringing Indians to threaten legal authorities, that's a hanging offense. Two Hawks spoke up, his English precise and dignified. We come as witnesses only, to observe white man's justice. Barrett made a dismissive sound. This is your last warning, Crow. Order your Apache friends to leave, and maybe we can still resolve this without bloodshed. A tense silence fell. Thomas could feel the moment balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong move would spark violence that would end with him dead or imprisoned and his land seized. But if he surrendered now, everything he and Catherine had built would be lost. Catherine, where was she? Had she reached the territorial capital safely? Or had something happened on the dangerous journey? The standoff was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, a larger party coming from the direction of town. Thomas tensed, expecting reinforcements for the sheriff. Instead, he was astonished to see Catherine at the head of the group, sitting tall in the saddle beside a distinguished-looking man in an official uniform. Marshal Jenkins, Sheriff Davis identified, his voice betraying surprise and concern. What brings the territorial marshal out this way? The marshal, a weathered man with steel-gray hair and piercing eyes, surveyed the scene with evident displeasure. Serious allegations of corruption and abuse of power, Sheriff. Your mayor is already in custody. Barrett stepped forward. There must be some mistake. We're here on legitimate railroad business. Save it, Barrett. The marshal cut him off. We've seen the documents Mrs. Crow delivered. Forged eviction notices, falsified land records, evidence of bribes paid to local officials. He produced an official-looking paper. I have a warrant for your arrest and for Sheriff Davis. Catherine dismounted and moved to Thomas's side, her face showing exhaustion but triumph. The governor was most interested in how Western Pacific has been conducting business in this territory, she said, particularly the methods used to acquire land. Thomas stared at her in wonder. This educated woman from Boston had ridden alone to the territorial capital and returned with the law itself at her side. Pride swelled in his chest. The marshal continued, all land seizures are suspended pending full investigation. Mr. Crow's deed has been verified as authentic and legally binding. He fixed Davis with a steely gaze. Sheriff, you will surrender your weapon and badge immediately. Davis's face contorted with rage. He reached for his gun, only to freeze as multiple weapons were leveled at him. Not just from the marshal's deputies, but from Wilson, Peters, and Thomas himself. Don't be foolish, Davis, the marshal warned. There's been enough lawlessness here. After a tense moment, the sheriff slowly removed his gun belt. One of the deputies approached to take his badge. Barrett attempted to edge his horse backward, looking for escape. Two Hawks and his men smoothly blocked his retreat. The Railroad Commission will hear about this, Barrett blustered. Western Pacific won't be stopped by frontier justice. This isn't frontier justice, Catherine replied calmly. It's the law properly applied. Something you seem to have forgotten exists. As the marshal's deputies took Davis and Barrett into custody, Catherine turned to Thomas. The weeks of strain, the dangerous journey, the confrontation, all showed in her exhausted face, yet her eyes shone with quiet triumph. It's over, she said softly. Our home is safe. Thomas took her hand, drawing her closer. You did this, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You saved everything. Catherine shook her head. We did it together. All of us. She gestured to the gathered allies, Wilson, Peters, Two Hawks and his people, the neighbors who had stood with them against seemingly insurmountable odds. Together, Thomas agreed, his heart full as he looked at the woman who had transformed his solitary existence into something rich with connection and purpose. Always together. 1 year later, the setting sun painted the western sky in hues of gold and crimson as Thomas stood on the porch of their expanded cabin. What had once been a Spartan shelter for one was now a proper home. A main room with stone fireplace, a separate bedroom, and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. Behind it stood the rebuilt schoolhouse, larger than before with windows that caught the morning light. Children's voices drifted across the yard as Catherine dismissed her afternoon class. Through the open door, Thomas could see her moving among the students, 20 now from families as far as 15 miles away. Her reputation as an educator had spread throughout the territory, drawing those who valued learning regardless of background or heritage. Remember to practice your reading, she called as the children scattered to waiting parents. 2 pages each night. Thomas watched with quiet pride as his wife bid farewell to each child. Peters and Johnson children alongside Two Hawks' youngest son and daughter. Ranch hands children next to the territorial marshal's granddaughter who boarded with them during the week. The world Catherine had envisioned was taking shape around them, one small victory at a time. Thinking deep thoughts, husband? She asked, joining him on the porch after the last student departed. Good thoughts, he corrected, offering her the cup of coffee he'd prepared. Catherine accepted gratefully, leaning against the porch rail beside him. The silver hairpin that had been his mother's glinted in her hair, now a permanent fixture. At 32, with a year of frontier life behind her, she carried herself with a confidence that complemented her natural grace. The Boston schoolteacher remained in her precise speech and tidy appearance, but sun and wind had kissed her skin, and hard work had strengthened her slender frame. "I received a letter from the governor today," she said after a comfortable silence. "He's appointed a new railroad commissioner who actually enforces the regulations. The Western Pacific Spur Line will follow the original route, well south of our property." Thomas nodded with satisfaction. "Good news." And, Catherine continued, a hint of excitement in her voice, "He's proposed territorial funding for rural schools, using our program as a model." Thomas smiled at her enthusiasm. "Your program." "Our program," she corrected gently. "Your lessons on natural history are as valuable as my reading instruction. The children thrive on both." It was true. Thomas had discovered an unexpected talent for teaching the practical knowledge he'd accumulated over years of solitary survival. The same quiet observation that made him an excellent scout translated well to helping young minds understand the patterns of nature. "Feels strange sometimes," he admitted. "All this change." Catherine studied him. "Do you ever regret answering my letter? Taking on a wife and all that followed?" Thomas shook his head without hesitation. "Never. Best decision I ever made." He turned to face her directly. "You gave me back a world I'd given up on." Catherine's eyes softened. "And you gave me a home I never knew I needed." They stood in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, stars emerging in the vast darkness above. From inside came the soft creaking of the rocking chair where Grey Wolf often sat during his frequent visits, carved pipe in hand, telling stories of the old days to anyone who would listen. "I have something to tell you," Catherine said finally, a blend of nervousness and joy in her voice. "Something important." Thomas turned to her, instantly alert. "What is it?" Catherine took his hand, guiding it gently to rest against her stomach. "We're going to have a child," she said softly. "In the winter." Thomas went completely still, his eyes wide with wonder. "A child," he repeated, the words barely audible. "Our child." Catherine nodded, watching his face anxiously. "Are you pleased?" Instead of answering immediately, Thomas knelt before her, pressing his ear against her still flat abdomen as if he might hear the tiny life within. When he looked up, his usually stoic face was transformed by naked emotion. "More than pleased," he said, his voice rough. "Honored. Blessed." He rose and gathered her carefully in his arms, as if she had suddenly become fragile and precious beyond measure. "When did you know?" "I've suspected for a few weeks," Catherine admitted. "Martha Wilson confirmed it yesterday." Thomas's mind raced with plans and preparations. "The cabin will need to expand again. Add a nursery, and the winter can be harsh. Need to stock more supplies, ensure." Catherine laughed, laying a finger against his lips. "We have time, Thomas. Months yet." He nodded, taking a deep breath to calm himself. "Right. Time." His hand returned to her stomach, protective and reverent. "Boy or girl, this child will have what I didn't. A home where both halves of their heritage are honored. Where they belong completely." "Yes," Catherine agreed, leaning into his embrace. "A child of two worlds, at home in both." Later that evening, after Catherine had retired to bed, Thomas sat at his workbench in the barn, carefully carving a cradle from cedar wood. His father's knife, now his by Grey Wolf's blessing, moved with practiced precision over the timber, bringing forth curves and patterns that blended Apache symbols with Eastern designs. As he worked, Thomas remembered the words he'd spoken to Catherine at their first meeting, words that had been both confession and warning. "I haven't seen a woman in 10 years. A smile touched his lips as he continued carving. How different his life had become since that day, from isolation to connection, from guarded solitude to a home filled with purpose and, soon, a child's laughter. The train that had brought Catherine to Broken Creek Station had carried more than just a mail-order bride. It had delivered second chances, healing, and the promise of a future neither of them could have imagined alone. Outside, the vast desert night wrapped around their homestead, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. Inside, by the light of a single lamp, Thomas Crow carved a cradle for his child, his heart full with the simple, profound miracle of belonging.